Hey, welcome to the What the Tech podcast, where we explore the latest advances in technology and break down the complexities of everyday tech for our listeners. Now, today we'll actually be speaking with an ethical hacker about a crazy real-life story of hacking a password management company. Can you believe that? So tune in to hear firsthand how this well-known hacker was able to infiltrate the system. And that's not all. We'll actually be discussing some of the real-life risks that we all face in our digital world. So sit back, relax, and join us as we dive deeper into this exciting topic. Let's go. All right. Our guest today is Jason Haddix, the Chief Information Security Officer at ButtleBot. He is an ethical hacker, as I mentioned before, and a computer security expert who has been involved with cybersecurity and ethical hacking since 2000. He has extensive experience in researching, analyzing digital systems for their vulnerabilities, as well as working on detection methods for malicious code and intrusion prevention. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks for having me, Troy. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Well, as many of my listeners know, I already had the man, the myth, the legend, Luke Seacrest on here. And he told me on that conversation that I absolutely had to have you on here because of your extensive background and experience and some of the stories that you have about just situations. So I'm excited to jump into that. But before I do, I'd like everybody to get to know you a little bit better. Curious, where did all of this start for you?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been a computer kid, right? In my early childhood, video games were my introduction to computers, and then I got my own PC early when I was probably 14, no, maybe even earlier, 12. I had a 486 Acer machine, and I picked up some books on, at that time it was like the very beginning of the web, so HTML, and then also how to use DOS and stuff like that. And so that was my intro to computers. Kind of just was curious about how they worked. But really, most of my hacking experience was at the end of high school and college. I was always the IT kid that would fix the teachers' computers and stuff like that. And then when I got into college, the thing that happened to me was I tried to buy a fake ID basically from one of my friends, and it turned out to be really, really horrible. And I got busted at the fact I tried to use it to buy a drink at an 18 and over 18 and over bar, right? So they had it separated where you had a wristband and you could only buy drinks if you were over 21 at a certain section of the bar. And I tried to go, I thought I'd be sly and go to that part with my fake ID and get a drink. And I was 20. I was only 1 year away from, legal drinking age. But I got, it got confiscated because it was really crappy. And I got really mad about it. And I was like, well, I bet I could do this myself. And so I went to what was then the underbelly of the internet, the dark web, and started researching well, how do you make a fake ID? And so what that landed me on is the underground forums and their version back then, which were things like Shadow Crew, Carter's Counterfeit Library, Carter's Market, all these forums before what it is today. And I started learning about how to make fake IDs, and I started making them myself, and just to sell to my friends. And this is many, many, many years ago, so all this is past. But in that ecosystem, there are three types of people in that ecosystem of kind of the underground markets. There are the carders who use the fake credit cards that they make. They are the hackers who supply them the credit card numbers, who get them off of hacking into websites usually. And then there are the ID makers who have to make the ID to match the fake name to the credit card, so these people can cash out at a store usually. This is a little bit before chip and pin was really, really popular. And so through that interaction, I got to be friends with a lot of the hackers on those sites and learn about kind of what they were doing and hear about it. And so throughout that journey, I had maybe sold one ID or two IDs or something like that, not very many, but I was getting really good at the art of doing it. And it was kind of like an art project to me, right? Like I didn't even really care about making money or whatever. Just the idea that I could do something like this was very cool. And there's a community involved around it. And so the forum got busted by the Secret Service, actually, Shadow Crew, which was the one I was a part of. And so all the top members, went to prison. It was a worldwide raid by, the Secret Service, the FBI, the Interpol, the Canadian Mounties, like you name it, every law enforcement agency got involved. It was the first big cybercrime bust of one of these forums. And so they actually put up an image on the website after they took it over of Shadow Crew, and it was a dark shadowy figure behind bars, and it said like, "We're coming for all of you." And it was super scary, and I was basically scared straight from that moment on. Um, and so when I went back to community college, I went and there was an elective class at this time. It was called Ethical Hacking and Network Defense. It was the first time I had ever heard of anything like it, so I thought I'd take it. I took this community college class, and it was woefully out of date even by the time I took the course. And so, I took it and I was talking to my teacher, and I'm like, yeah, a lot of this stuff is like, this is, already 5 years old, the stuff you're teaching in this class. And I know because I've seen what real hackers are doing. And he's like, hey, if you are really interested in this stuff, you should consider doing it as a job. I'm like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, there's this thing called penetration testing or ethical hacking, and you can use the skills that you've learned for good, and you can get paid a lot of money for it. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, here's how it works. And so from that moment, basically, I dove into the idea of ethical hacking and doing it as a job, and I've been on this journey for 20 years now, basically learning how to do what attackers do, learning all of the techniques in the different domains, and it's a wide world of research, and it's always fun because there's new stuff coming out. And so yeah, that's now what I do for a living. So yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. There's so many stories of that where it doesn't go that way. I mean, I think about my own background. I grew up in a one-parent home. My dad was not around, alcoholic. I was on the party scene. I was doing all sorts of things that I shouldn't be doing. And for me, it was a different thing that happened. But at the end of the day, I got basically kind of straight at the right time before some bad things happened. And some very close friends of mine, one particular, is in prison now and has been for 13 years. I mean, not even doing anything near what I was doing at the time. And so, it's nice to hear that, hey, look, that little scare kind of puts you on the right path. But the exciting thing is that now you get to beat up on the guys that didn't do that, right? And, protect people, because, like, look, this is some scary stuff when you really think about it.
Yeah.
Somebody getting a hold of your identity or your information, and then the things that can happen. And you're going to share some of those stories with us today. So I'm excited to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One particular I was made aware of was when apparently there's some sort of situation where you had actually hacked into a password management company and exposed some things. So I don't have all the details, but I'm very interested to hear how that all played out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so this was early on in my career doing a penetration test, and we were contracted through that company to do a penetration test of a password manager. And this was before any market leader had really taken over in that space yet, right? Password managers were, pretty new, and there were quite a few of them. And so we got contracted, and the sub context of this story is that this company, who called us, they were forced to get, basically a security audit because of compliance, right? A compliance will force many companies, depending on what you're doing with customer data, to get a penetration test every year. And so this company was being forced to get one. They didn't really want one. So they had found us somehow, and we had the sweetest sales lady ever. Her name was Deanna, and they were so verbally abusive to her on the call. She was almost in tears after like I think the second or third call. But we were a small company, and we needed every opportunity that we could get for taking clients. And so they ended up selecting us out of a couple companies to do the security audit. But she came to us and she said, please, like, find something great, and show these guys what's up. And they were pretty aggressive towards our tech team too. When we did the scoping call, they were like, "You guys aren't going to find anything. Like, this is a waste of our time. We're only doing this because we have to." Um, and so like, it's now that I look back on it, it's a double-edged sword because like, I guess if you want the best value out of your penetration testers and hackers, you should, treat them like that because we really took it as kind of an insult to both Deanna and our engineering team, and we put the team on this test. And so, it was a password manager site. They had a website, and they had also a password manager extension that you put in your browser, and it basically grabbed all of your web passwords and stored them there, and it's supposed to be a secure vault and no one's supposed to touch it. And I had spent like a week. The engagement time usually for a penetration test is 2 weeks, right? And so um, most of the testing is done in the first week, and then like the second week is usually reporting or wrapping up or just retesting and stuff like that. And so I was on, Friday of the first week of the test, and I really hadn't found much. I had enumerated this website that they had, and I had looked at the extension, but there wasn't anything like really jumping out at me. And so I had found this portion of the website where where they had put basically a URL that handled a link and it redirected you somewhere. And when you see something like this as a web penetration tester, this is one of the areas that you try to look at because something is handling that link in the code and trying to force you to browse somewhere. And instead, I wanted it to browse internally into their own network and see if I could grab something from their internal, application or their internal network or something like that. And in the scene, this is called a local file include. And so, what I did is basically I banged at this thing for, a day, and then I brought in my friend Paul at the time, who is a brilliant web engineer. It's so weird. This small company I worked at the time ended up, all the people from there, which it's now no longer existent, but all the people from there went on to do great things, work at crazy companies. We just all happened to work out of this garage on the same team at one time. But yeah, so we ended up banging on it together, and at the end of day 5, we had a breakthrough and we were able to pull files out through this vulnerability, this local file include vulnerability. And so we could ask the web server to retrieve local files on the web server. And so this is the first success in, kind of the chain of attacking the site. We were able to ask the web server to request its own password file on Linux, its etc password file, and some of its configuration files. And what we had done during the engagement is we had mapped out every page of the website and the technology they had used to build it, which was pretty easy to do. That's not like hardcore hacking. It's just looking at the README files that are installed and everything. And so we knew that they were using this certain technology to build their website. And so we installed that technology locally on one of our computers and servers, and that gave us an idea of what kind of default files were installed on the server. And so then we had a list of all those files, and we checked for those files on their server using this vulnerability to give us the source code of those pages. And so we were able to basically pull down all of their web source code using this vulnerability. And baked inside of their version of the web source code were passwords and API keys. And we had found a couple of places. They had phpMyAdmin, which is a database GUI management system, and one of the passwords worked there. And we were able to get into the backend GUI for the database, which was a huge win for us. And that had all of the users' usernames and passwords in it for their thing. So that was pretty much game over by then. But we didn't want to stop there. We wanted to keep going. And so we had found some integration or weird URLs basically during our enumeration of the website, and one of them was like the site.com/Gmail, and we didn't know what it was. It didn't do anything when you visit that page. It was just a blank page. And so when we used this vulnerability to echo out the source code of that page, it turned out that it was their lead developer working on an integration for Gmail, basically, of their site. And so when we echoed out the source code, we actually got the email authentication for their main developer of their site. So we were able to log into his Gmail, and we took a screenshot of us in his Gmail, and it associated to his Gmail, he had stored some code for the plugin that was associated to this website in his Google Drive. And so we were able to access his Google Drive and see the source code for the plugin. or the extension. And so we started looking at the source code for the extension, and we realized there were some security vulnerabilities there, and then we were able to exploit those. And through the database and that access, we were able to poison the extension so that if any new user would download the new extension, we would automatically have them send their passwords to us and the company. And so we were able to backdoor the plugin. We were able to completely own and deface their website. We had personal email access of their lead developer, and we ended up getting full corporate access to their corporate LAN eventually as well as a whole bunch of other vulnerabilities in the second week of the test. We made all of that progress. So that's my story of hacking a password manager company, and it was it was a good one with the team, and yeah, so we were able to give them that report and the offboarding call. They were flabbergasted at everything and how one small vulnerability can snowball into such massive ownage, and they definitely took us seriously at that point. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I can only imagine the look on their faces when you tell them I basically have control over everything I wanted, and it was just one small little thing,
Yeah.
and that really is crazy. So, for most companies, like knowing that they probably have software that's protecting, they're probably using ethical hackers like yourself. Uh, there's still vulnerabilities, right? And so like what's the real extent to, I mean, we've heard about some of this in the news, of course, when Experian gets hacked or
Yeah.
something like that, but like what is the real time exposure for the majority of organizations out there? And I mean, obviously the fallout could be huge, but like every company probably has holes, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, every company has vulnerabilities. It's hard because when you're dealing, like a lot of my last 7 years has been security leadership. So chief information security officer is the guy who quarterbacks the whole plan, right? At a company. And the security program, how you invest your money, that you have your budget, and so when you look at any big company, these days it's your footprint that gets you. So you end up growing as a company and growing in employees, and then eventually what happens is you lose track of all of your IT assets. You have what's called shadow IT, and so you end up having websites that marketing stood up to do like a random marketing campaign, or you end up having websites that a development team was using to do some QA testing or some dev work that's beta and not production, or whatever. You're working with a third party SaaS and you forget to configure it well, but you give them access to some of your systems. And so there's a lot of ways as you grow to be a larger company that you just lose track of your attack surface, basically. And so what I'm really good at is understanding the attack surface of big companies, the technologies they use and how they work. And like when you get attacked as a big company, my previous role was the CISO at Ubisoft, and we had a couple big threat actors come after us. Ubisoft's a video game company. They make Assassin's Creed,
Right.
the Rainbow Six games, and stuff like that. And so one of the things there is that that changed my perspective on some of this. Is as a CISO, I was very interested in the technical vulnerabilities and the idea of the loss of PII, which is personal identifiable information, and it's something you mentioned. But one of the things actually that I realized when protecting Ubisoft, and we had a downtime event where a threat actor actually breached us and caused a significant downtime, is actually downtime is the most painful thing when you're on the receiving end, because we were down at Ubisoft for a couple days, and then extensively some of our offices, our remote work capabilities were affected for about 2 weeks, and that cost us in the double digits, millions of dollars, having actual downtime. And so um, you have to prioritize your security program to keep away from different priorities, and that's one. Like being breached and losing personal information is really important, but I would say it's number two behind the opportunity for someone to actually bring your business offline. And so then you bring those questions back and those concerns, and you're like, okay, how do we protect against this as a business? And then you draft your security strategy based on that. And one of the first parts of the reason I mentioned the attack surface is you have to know your external attack surface, and that has to be a core component of your security program at a big company or a small company, right? Like if you don't know what you're protecting, there's no way to protect against the kind of people that are going to exploit and try to attack you. So that is the kind of exposure that many people see. I am really good at that. I've been doing bug bounties for probably the last I want to say 10 years, and I'm very active in that scene. I'm still on some of the world ranked leaderboards in the top 100, and so like one of my things is that when I get handed a bug bounty, for a big company, or when I'm doing red team work with ButtoBot, when I'm helping out the engineers, it's mapping out their attack surface and finding this little place that they forgot to implement security or they forgot about completely, and we get in through there, and that's it's usually the weakest link that gets you, right? So yeah.
Right. I am curious. So between fact and fiction,
Hmm.
we see all these things on TV and they're sensationalized a little bit, I'm sure. But like, to what extent, are there people at your level, or at least even if they had a little more time than you did, have
Hmm.
the capabilities to do this sort of penetration and or hacking that you see at the level that you were able to access with this password management company?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, at the level that could do, that kind of stuff is ethically, I would say there's, maybe in the low, you know, hundreds of thousands of security engineers in the world who could do that kind of work. It's basically
Okay.
just web security work. So that makes it still pretty specialized in the world, right? Um, so
Considering how
yeah,
many people are actually in technology, right?
exactly, right? Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's a burgeoning industry, learning how to do ethical hacking and things like that. Uh, there is a difference in the world of, in my world of offensive security, we call it. Um, when you're doing penetration testing or web security testing or whatever you want to call it, we tend to focus on the technical. And real attackers these days will take the easiest route to breaching a company. And so they will attack users, which are the weakest link usually, with phishing and stuff like that. And so many companies nowadays will overly focus on the technical vulnerabilities and having technical tests done. And they'll be like, oh, we don't want to do phishing, or we don't want to simulate phishing or educate because it's just a losing battle or whatever. And that has been the prevailing thought for a long time. But really, there is a disconnect a little bit between what the industry does and what real attackers do. And so that's kind of what we try to do at ButtoBot with our methodology is simulate a real attacker. So we integrate phishing into our testing. We look for stuff on the dark web for already compromised credentials for sale for companies. We do a lot of, we try to emulate the adversary as completely as possible in our services. So, yeah, I mean that's kind of what we do. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much about this that we could talk about. So when it came to this password management company, obviously it was nice to the fact that maybe they had to do this, but that you exposed it. But how many organizations go on today not knowing that they've been exposed and information, valuable information is leaking out? Like, what is it? A large portion, and are these organizations and or hackers, are they going after more of the individuals, or are they focused more on corporations? And if so, is there a size of corporation that they're usually targeting more than others, just from a value for their own personal gain?
Yeah, I mean, 100% of companies are vulnerable, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is no company that doesn't have security vulnerabilities. I've said this in talks, right? It's just a matter of, when the attacker takes time to look at you, right? And how skilled the attacker is and how many hurdles you put in place. Attackers are people. And at the end of the day, if you've put enough hurdles in front of them and done enough good, security hygiene and protection, they will give up after a little while unless they are like a nation state level, threat actor. And those ones that's their job. So they will continue to hammer against you for, long periods of time. But most opportunistic hackers, they will give up after a little while if they don't have success. They'll move on to the next company because they are, like I said, opportunistic. They're trying to, ransomware a company to elicit, a ransomware payment, and it's a business model to them. So they will, target the weakest companies, faster and try to get them to pay and things like that. So the difference, between it, like I said, is many threat actors these days are opportunistic, so they will look for technical vulnerabilities, and sometimes they're very easy depending on how bad the security hygiene of the company is. Um, but other times, they will go after the weakest link, like I said, and they'll use phishing. And so that's why we're having this big shift right now in the kind of tech space to move away from just passwords and move away to things like YubiKeys and stuff like that you can plug into your computer and touch, and it's an extra layer of security. And so Google has moved completely passwordless to YubiKeys, and we're hoping other big companies do this. And what this does is this prevents a lot of the phishing attacks that are really easy these days. I could send you a phishing email that's pretty convincing, from one of our servers at ButtaBot, and I can make it look like it's coming from a legitimate place, and I could make the template look like something you expect, and I would do extensive research on you, maybe it's Broncos season ticket, holder information or something like that.
Right.
And yeah,
That'll do it.
yeah, that'll do it, right? I mean, for me, it could be any number of things, right? I am not
Right.
immune either. And you could click on this link, and it would pop up, an authentication for Gmail or Microsoft authentication, and it would look just like the site. And then you would put your credentials in, and really that would be my page, and you'd be putting your credentials into my page. And then it would ask you for two-factor authentication if you're a good security hygiene person. And this is where most people think they're protected, right? Is with this two-factor authentication. But I can also capture your two-factor authentication token and then relay it immediately to the site with your username and password and take over your session, and then forward your session back to you so you didn't know anything happened. And then I have a copy of your session on my browser, and I can log into everything that you can log into. And so this has been, the prevailing attack for the last 8 years, I would say, is this man-in-the-middle authentication hijacking attack,
Hmm.
with the initial access of phishing. And so what the FIDO key does is it puts a roadblock in there, is that you have to have something physical, the UV key, right, to touch. And I can't relay that with that type of technology. And so I have to move to other things. I have to try to trick you into downloading a file which exploits your computer, which is much harder because you might have antivirus software or EDR software from your work or something like that. So it's much harder for me as an adversary to own you. And so uh, that is where we're trying to move as an industry, is make these big leaps and bounds to protect users with things like that. But that is, only companies right now like Google that are getting there, right? Like, or Twitter did that a long time ago. They moved all over to YubiKeys, and these are called FIDO tokens, is the class of those things. You don't have to use YubiKey. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, right now it's prevailing. The easiest way to get in is phishing for most
Hmm.
organizations because there's just so many opportunities.
Yeah. So if you were to if, stack rank the critical nature of like, hey, this is like I attacked this and I got in. Like this is like the top of the heap, sort of like access to something. Uh, how would you stack rank those things? Because you mentioned ransomware, accessing passwords and things like that. Like, what would be like for one of these hackers, like the promised land, as far as like I was able to get in and do X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, I mean, normally it's access to some sort of database with credit card information. Like if you can get that as an adversary, you're pretty happy. Or if you can ransomware a significant portion of the network and demand a ransom from the company, right? Those are success objectives. Um, in my case, when I was a defender and on the leadership side at Ubisoft, our threat actors, a couple of them didn't want ransom at all. They just wanted to own us because we were a gaming company and bring us offline for the clout, for the lulz. And so that could also be an objective to an adversary group.
Just to
Yeah.
flex their
Oh
muscles a
yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's in the hacker manifesto, right? Control is a big thing. So yeah, so their objectives could be a couple of things. When I'm on a red team engagement, if we can get access to the internal network and we can control the Microsoft infrastructure, because most businesses run on Microsoft these days, through controlling their domain controller and having admin access there. That's the holy grail. If I can go from the web to your internal network and control everything, I mean, that means I have every user's password. I have complete control of all your technology because Microsoft is connected to it all. I have access to all your databases, which have all of your credit card information, user accounts, and That is the holy grail usually for like a penetration test or a red team attack. But there are other objectives, like I said, too, for real adversaries.
Wow. So I'm curious, for every ransomware attack that we actually hear about, that somebody pays a pretty coin to make go away,
Hmm.
or get their their system back, right? How many of those are happening that we don't hear about?
A ton, honestly, a
Really?
ton. Yeah. I mean, you're required when you have an event to report it to your local legislature, not legislature, but your local compliance, for whatever country you're in. So, Ubisoft was based in France, and we had to, report to our regulatory body. Sorry, that's what I was looking for, regulatory body. But there's no law requiring that you have to disclose much about it to the public. So you can say, hey, we're having a security event, and that's as much as you can do. Now, if it's public and the attackers are forcing your hand, a lot of companies will do a full breach disclosure of what's happening, where we're at, this is what we're doing, and but there's not a lot of law right now verbatim saying that you have to do it this way. Basically, you just have to disclose it to your regulators so that they know that there's an issue. And usually, if you're a big company, you get the FBI involved to try to figure out, like who and what group is attacking you. Yeah, I mean the playbook is the incident response playbook for being targeted and a successful intrusion or breach is it's a stressful time. I've been on the other end of it, and sometimes you get calls at all hours of the morning. There's something going wrong, we're under attack, and then you're getting into that mode of response and eradication and figuring out what's going on, investigation, and yeah, that's a whole nother podcast we could do. Yeah. Yeah.
A couple things about that. Do you ever feel like, because of what you do, that like you're on somebody's hit list?
When I worked at BugCrowd, which was my job before Ubisoft. So BugCrowd is a bug bounty platform. I was an executive there as well as head of operations, and I had access to many companies' security data because we were running their bug bounties. And that was the time where I felt the most targeted, I think. And I did get targeted a couple times, but nothing ever serious, right? Like, I think the worst that happened one time was, someone, some probably kid. I mean, I don't know, but called my wife and found her phone number, called my wife, and threatened to. I don't know if they even had a hook, right? But they were like, "Hey, I know your wife's phone number," and they called her, and then they called me, and like, just to prove that they had my personal information, which is not hard to get. Like, my contact information is out there. I'm a public speaker, and people could find out all this stuff. Um, and just trying to intimidate me and stuff like that. But obviously that didn't work out for them, and yeah, so every once in a while you get a little bit of that that you feel personally targeted. Like you just have to be vigilant. Good password use, right? Like if you feel like you're a target because of what you do, like good password use, strong passwords, two-factor authentication. Make sure that all of your devices run security software, just the basics of computing, basically. And and then I reformat my box all the time just to make sure that it's a clean bill of health. So reinstall Windows from scratch every quarter or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, geez, that's way more often. I run it until it dies, like everybody else probably.
I am so paranoid because of my job. It's like anytime my system even glitches minorly, I'm like, okay, time to burn it all down, rebuild. Like, let's go. So, yeah.
Oh, that's hilarious. So, in your mind, what is the greatest threat to just companies? Is it overseas collusion that we're hearing? With all this stuff with we heard with Russia and North Korea and China doing things, which we know they do, but or is it the consortiums of hackers, these like groups of hackers, or is it the individual? Like, where is the big firepower? Where's the scary thing? Like, if you were to say, I'm worried about this, where would you say you would focus your time?
Yeah, right now it's ransomware groups, I would say. It's still ransomware groups. It has been for the last, 5 years, I would say. These organized groups like Lockbit is one of the prevailing ones right now. And what Lockbit is an organization of um, you know criminals and hackers. But what they do is they develop really sophisticated ransomware programs, like the actual stuff that locks the computer and does the ransom, and then they make it a ransomware as a service business. So they sell that software to opportunistic individuals or groups, hackers, who will use their hacks and then install that malware, and Lockbit gets basically a cut if the company pays the ransom, and if the company doesn't pay the ransom, then all of their information gets dumped on the internet. And so Lockbit right now has hundreds of companies who they've ransomwared, and so the initial access differs, but the ransomware company is the service. And so, like it's hard to say, is there any big one prevailing vulnerability that leads to initial access? Sometimes it's phishing, sometimes it's exploiting someone's cloud or website. Sometimes it is malicious insider, access that gets sold to one of these groups. But if I were just to pull it off the top of my head, right, I think what I've seen a lot in the last 5 years is cloud, right? The migration from on-prem to cloud, or hybrid cloud, in the tech space, left a lot to be desired for security. And so a lot of default configurations were pushed to the web. A lot of data leakage happens with things like S3 buckets leaking big portions of data, or just dumb things like usernames and default usernames and passwords, or things like that. That's one big area I think that um, stronger access control, better default configurations needs to happen, is in the cloud arena when we're all moving to cloud. The other one is basically training your users and adding protections for your users, right? So if you can make the switch to FIDO keys, or things like YubiKeys, right, that mitigates a large portion of the phishing problem, which is one of the other initial access vectors for attackers. And so if you can do that, then you're in way better shape than most companies. If you can't do that, then there's forms of two-factor authentication, which are like Google has their authenticator, and Microsoft has their authenticator, and things like that. That'll add two-factor authentication, and that's the next level down. But it does offer more increase than no two-factor authentication of security. So protecting your users from phishing, making sure that your cloud configuration is great and your website security hygiene is good, to make sure that you get a web penetration test or a web audit every year, to make sure that you look for that. You can use things like bug bounties to augment some of these programs. And then, once an initial access vector, this is what we call it in the in the scene, is an initial access vector. That's why I keep on saying that. Once someone finds an initial access vector, which usually one will be found, is like how good are you after your armor is breached, right? And so that's other good security hygiene, right? It's having endpoint protection or antivirus on all of your employees' laptops, right? Because that will stop 60% of what an attacker is going to do once they're breach the armor. And then after that, if they've managed to bypass that, how well is your access control for your users and their permissions? How much is that locked down? And so that's kind of how I look at a security program these days. That's how I prioritize the things I'm protecting when I build a security program, or when I talk to other companies building their program and they want to ask questions. So.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, because that helps a generalist like me really understand exactly what goes into it. I am curious. So outside of some of the projects that you've shared with, like, what are some of the other interesting things that you've done? Just kind of round it about, and then I have a couple closing questions here. But like, I'm curious, like, other fun projects or types of projects that you've worked on, that you've found some interesting ways in.
Yeah, I mean, man, I've done a whole bunch of stuff. So in my offensive security career, I've done a ton of bug bounties and penetration tests and red team engagements. So the password manager is one. The other one that I've talked about before is the one of the companies I tested against was a medical alert company. So like if your dad or your grandpa or something like that, like has a health condition, sometimes they wear these devices where they can immediately call EMS, emergency medical services, usually a private company. And they will send out a hospital immediately, like if they fall or something like that, right? My mom has one of these, and so I was contracted to test a company like that, and I ended up finding I'll make this story really short, but I ended up finding a service of theirs, and it was supposed to be their development environment. It wasn't supposed to be their production environment. It wasn't supposed to be able to do anything, but I ended up hacking it and setting off a greater portion of LA's basically sensors for the elderly people who had these alert devices. And so basically, emergency medical staff and ambulances were preparing to go out across most of LA. And I got a call from the client, and they're like, "Hey, did you happen to like do anything, today? Because we got a massive influx of, you know, calls, and I didn't know what I was doing was this, right? I had seen an API on the server. I was testing it like a normal security tester would have. There was no way for me to know this was what I was doing. It was so abstract of, like that this API did this thing, and it wasn't supposed to be connected to production anyway. It was supposed to be a development environment, but it was. And so it ended up sending out the fleet to a whole bunch of people. They were able to call it back in the middle. I said, yes, I was testing. Here's what I was testing, and they were like, okay. So I mean, the takeaways there that like a development environment should never trigger, like a production environment's like code should be completely separate in most cases if you can make it that way. Also, for this particular company, it probably would have been better to contract us instead of a black box manner where we just go about it not really knowing what we're doing, in more of a clear box manner where we were more of like consultative and they told us what everything was, and we attempted to do a security audit rather than a black box penetration test, because with medical technology, you definitely want to be very sensitive. But that's what they had asked for, so I didn't really have any way to mitigate that at the time. But yeah, I mean that one was funny because the phone call I got was like, "Hey, we're sending out ambulances all across LA. Was this you?" And it's like, "Yes, that was absolutely me. I'm pretty sure." So talking to them, I've hacked a number of banks. I can't talk about or I can't state how many banks I've hacked, but at least 4 out of 5 of the big five banks had success there.
Whoa.
Um, Banks are companies just like other companies, right? So they have large footprints, and they're relatively easy to hack most of the time if you know what you're doing. Yeah, I mean, you name it, Uber, Snapchat, all those apps. I've found vulnerabilities in a lot of those companies. So yeah,
That's crazy.
yeah,
So, for you, what do you think the future of all this looks like? And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention AI and what that could potentially do
yep,
to the whole thing. So,
yeah.
why don't you share your kind of future ideas of what's going to happen? What are we going to see unfold?
Yeah, so this is actually a really exciting area of research, right? So I love to be on the cutting edge of security research. And so AI is right there. So I am actually helping um, host the AI Village at DEF CON. So DEF CON is the world's biggest hacker convention in Las Vegas in August. And they have villages which represent different ideas and technologies inside of DEF CON. And so the AI Village will be talking about the intersection of security and hacking and AI. And so right now what we're seeing is the world has kind of been taken storm by LLMs, right? Large language models, and specifically ChatGPT and what they can do with it, right? But in the future, these technologies, businesses are going to look at LLMs and ML and AI technology. They're going to want to monetize it, right? It's a huge opportunity for them. You own a big business and you're a bank, and you're like, hey, I can use an LLM to instantly ask intelligent questions of all of this data I've been collecting for years to do really great things, and it will help me, with my business in so many ways. And then also, I can make products and services that use LLMs in a way that I, have never been able to build applications before. And so what this will look like to the end user is your bank will come out with a new API that'll be like, this API or this website or this chatbot will help you manage your money way better. And it will specifically, based on your account history and your transaction, it will analyze all of your data in your account, and it'll tell you, what you should be investing in, what you shouldn't be investing in, things that you forgot to discontinue as subscriptions is, how your spending works. It'll be able to analyze all this for you using an LLM and different AI technology. But what they're doing is they're training all this data on your data on the back end, and at the end of the day, um, part of that API could be subject to security vulnerabilities. And so basically what we're looking at now is a lot of stuff called prompt injection, because a lot of these LLMs just use natural language, right? And so uh, if you think about, when they build this service, the API is using an LLM to gather all your data and analyze it. Well, what if you ask it to do something differently? What if instead of ask it to analyze your data, you ask it to analyze someone else's data? And so what this does is it takes my job, where I'm used to writing in code to exploit things on the keyboard, and it changes my job to being like almost like an English major. I am actually now using natural language to try to trick an LLM into giving me stuff I'm not supposed to have. And so I've been researching this in several areas, and like what the world is going to look like. But in 2 years or three, maybe even less, depending on how fast this stuff goes, all these businesses will rush to market with AI powered services, and the new attack vector will be attacking these AI services with natural language, trying to get them to, attack other users of the service, try to get them to exploit the service itself, or try to get them to steal data from the internal network where the service is hosted or the business that's hosting it using natural language. So it's an amazing, amazing kind of wild westy feeling. Like I was very in on the mobile world when iOS and Android were first getting big, and I was very into that security research and was one of the pioneers there. I feel the same way right now with AI and mobile. It's the whole world to figure out how to attack and defend, and it's going to be a wild, wild ride. It's going to be like when we first came out with the web, and there was so many vulnerabilities everywhere. And but hopefully we do better this time. Hopefully, this renaissance we get a little bit better. Yeah.
Yeah, I doubt that. If I'm just being honest, I think
Yeah.
there'll be people that do a good job, probably the slower adopters,
Yeah.
and then there'll be the ones that will be in the news
Yep.
because they didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's good to know that we've got people like yourself, and I said the same thing to Luke. Really keeping an eye on what those places of exposure are. Call it the good guys.
Yeah.
Do you have a cape somewhere behind you there?
I don't. Not all heroes wear capes. It's so funny. Is like many times when I go on a show or something like that, people are want me to tell my hacking stories, right? But at the end of
Sure.
the day, what I'm doing is acting like a bad guy so that people can get better, right? At the end of the day, I deliver PDFs, reports, and briefings to people to tell them how to get better. And that's the goal is I want, people to secure their sites and know how to secure their sites better. And so that's the other portion of my job that, it gets less talked about. But absolutely, it's really important to have people like me in this industry, ethical hackers, penetration testers, web security analysts, defenders, blue teamers, they're called red teamers. It's all this ecosystem of people who keep you safe, and you don't even know about them. You have these teams at your companies, and they're like working nonstop just to make sure that the company works and is secure and as secure as possible. It's a fascinating industry, and if you're in IT, or if you're in QA, or if you're even in help desk, right? My first job was in help desk, right? Like this is an area you can go into. It's totally approachable. In fact, not most, but a lot of really good people I know in this industry come out of QA because they have a very analytical mindset and they can follow a methodology for testing. And this is just a fancy, fancy form of testing. You learn new tools and techniques, and you learn to act like a bad guy. But there is a method to the madness, and if you can do it, it's a really interesting world to be a part of.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. It's changing at such a rate that I don't think any of us can really keep up with it. But it's good to know, like I said, that we've got good guys that maybe do or do not wear capes.
Yeah, yeah.
Protecting our better interests. So I want to say, hey, it was really a pleasure to have you on here, Jason. You're a wonderful guest. It's obvious that you've done this a few times before. Any parting advice for companies, corporations, founders of technology companies out there that you just leave them with before we shut it down here?
Yeah, it's hard to it's a hard job, right? Especially if you can't afford a staff. If you can afford a staff, get yourself a head security engineer, or a CISO, or somebody who can define a security program for you. If you have that kind of capital, right, that should be your investment. Make sure that it's someone good, right? I mean, but if you're so small that you don't have that kind of money for a staff, the things you got to look for are making sure that your tech and your IT lead implements two-factor everywhere, right? Two-factor authentication is going to save you in a lot of cases, and make sure that you have an endpoint protection program And yeah, I mean those are the two generals that like small companies can do, right? Like two-factor authentication, and making sure you have some type of antivirus software on your company's laptops that'll save you, like 75% of the time, 80% of the time, unless you're getting super, super targeted. They're not sexy, but that's just how it works. So yeah.
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 Awesome. Great advice. Well, I want to thank you again for coming on the show. And as always, I'd say thank you for listening to What the Tech. Make sure you boop that like button for my man, Jason, and for What the Tech. And we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.